Hey everyone, it's John Heath here again for Milton Rose Learning with another Let's Learn video on King Lear characters. So today what we're going to do, for anyone studying this fantastic tragedy, we're going to give a very quick who's who to the characters so we just understand who they are. Then we'll look at how a Jacobean audience interpreted these characters, and then we'll juxtapose that with a more modern interpretation because our views of the characters have changed. And then we'll round off by looking at a key character arc. So we will obviously look there at King Lear and how he evolves throughout the play. Okay, so first off, let's do a very quick who's who, just so we know who the main characters are in this tragedy. So first off then, we have the big guy, we have King Lear himself. Okay. So Lear then is an ageing monarch who very rashly divides his kingdom based on flattery. So those who tell him good things, they get land. Those who tell him bad things, they don't get land. So he therefore represents pride, the abuse of power, and the vulnerability of old age, which comes to us all. Okay, so in some ways he's a silly figure, but he's also a very sympathetic figure as well. Then we have Cordelia. So Cordelia is Lear's youngest daughter, but she's disowned for her honesty and integrity. She represents truth, loyalty, and unconditional love. Okay, then we have Goneril. Okay, look out for the snake emoji. So Goneril then, she is Lear's eldest daughter, very manipulative and power hungry. She therefore represents greed and ambition masked by false affection. She tells Lear what he wants to hear to get power and land and things like that, and it all goes downhill from there, hence the snake emoji. Okay, then we have Regan. So Regan then is King Lear's middle daughter, equally cruel and deceptive as Goneril. She represents cruelty, jealousy, and the lust for power. Okay, so he's got two bad daughters and one nice daughter, hasn't he? Then we've got Edmund. Okay, so Edmund then is Gloucester's illegitimate son, very cunning, ambitious. He represents deceit, manipulation, and the breakdown of the natural order. Because remember, the Jacobeans believed in the great chain of being, where the universe was structured by God, and Edmund is kind of messing around with that, so they would have been very, very negative towards that. Then we have Gloucester, poor old Gloucester. So he is a nobleman who is very loyal to King Lear, but he's betrayed by his illegitimate son Edmund, and he represents therefore blindness, both literal and metaphorical. I'll let you know, I'll let you read what happens to Gloucester, and also the dangers of misjudgment in high politics. If you get it wrong, it can be a fate worse than death, and Gloucester's fate is worse than death. Okay, then we have Kent. So Kent is basically Lear's loyal servant. He disguises himself to continue serving the king, and he represents therefore loyalty, honesty, and moral courage. Quite a straightforward characterization there. Then a really interesting figure in the play is the Fool. So the Fool is Lear's court jester or joker who speaks the truth disguised as humour. So he represents then wisdom in madness, and also, for me, he represents the moral conscience of the play, if we're going to be very clever about it, but maybe that's just my provocative kind of interpretation, but a very interesting character nevertheless. Okay, then we've got, if we make it a little bit more advanced now that we understand the characters, you need to understand for the high grades that characters can be interpreted very differently over time. So we've done a little table for you of the key characters, and on the left, as you can see, we have the Jacobean audience at the time and how that character was interpreted by them about 400 or 500 years ago. And then on the right, after decades of feminist theory and psychoanalysis, we've got the modern reader's response, or the modern audience's response, and how they would interpret the character. So let's have a really good look through this table. I think you'll find this quite useful. So first off, let's do King Lear. Okay, so we've got, let's just get it lined up. There we go. Okay, so we've got a Jacobean audience on the left would see Lear as a tragic figure whose fall reflects divine justice, and the dangers of pride. He's pulled down by God because they were obviously Christians, and he doesn't rule properly, and so he suffers divine kind of retribution. However, a modern interpretation, the modern audience, would view King Lear as extremely flawed psychologically and emotionally, but also a sympathetic victim of ageing. So, for instance, if you think of maybe your nan and granddads and stuff, we live a lot longer now than the Jacobeans. So we see the aging process more often, and we see it for longer. So we would see Lear as like, oh, maybe he's getting, I don't know, dare I even say, like maybe a little bit of dementia or something like that. And we would feel a bit more sympathetic towards him. Okay. He's also betrayed by his family, and that's not what we expect in life. So we can't be too hard on Lear, and I think a modern interpretation is a bit more sympathetic. Then we have Cordelia, if you can see. So she would be revered in the Jacobean era as the ideal daughter, loyal and very virtuous. She doesn't lie to King Lear. She speaks truth to power, as they say. A modern interpretation would be similar. They'd admire the moral integrity and the emotional strength as an upright female paragon. Paragon, we mean example, a shining example of a really good daughter. Goneril. Okay, so on the left we have the Jacobean. They would condemn her as unnaturally ambitious and disobedient. She doesn't really follow her father properly and disturbs that great chain of being. She disturbs the natural order of things. Then on the right, a modern audience would view her maybe as a slightly more complex product of patriarchy, although she still is ruthless. Patriarchy means male domination, and Goneril is trying to break out of that. But we might be slightly more sympathetic, but not much. Regan. So again, similar. In the Jacobean era, they would have seen her as cruel and power hungry, lacking proper femininity almost. She's quite masculine in the way that she acts. Then a modern interpretation on the right would have interpreted her as a symbol of internalised oppression, if we're being a bit more psychoanalytical. Sigmund Freud would be happy there. And unchecked ambition and the dangers of ambition. Okay. Edmund, Jacobean audience on the left, would despise him as a villain, rebelling against the natural order, the great chain of being, as we know. Then on the right, modern interpretation would be seeing him as a compelling outsider fighting against social injustice, although he is still morally wrong. So in the modern era with Edmund, we maybe saw him as a bit of a grey character, kind of, not white or black, but a kind of grey moral character. Gloucester, oh, poor Gloucester. On the left, you've got the Jacobean audience. They would have pitied him for his suffering and blindness to truth. I think that's definitely true. But on the right, modern audiences were a lot more sophisticated now. So we would have sensed his tragic parallels to King Lear himself. Lear is metaphorically blind. Gloucester becomes literally blind. So there's a real tragic parallel across the two characters. You definitely want to tease that out in an essay. And it evokes empathy then for his vulnerability when he is blinded. Then we have Kent. So Jacobean, they would have admired him for his loyalty and plain speaking honesty. Fairly straightforward. A modern audience would still respect him, although they might question his blind loyalty to power. Why are you following King Lear when he's going off the edge of a cliff? It doesn't make much sense. And the modern audience is a little bit more cynical, and I think we would be more cynical towards Kent. Then the Fool, Jacobean audience, would he be valued as a truth teller? He's using his wits to challenge King Lear, because if you told it him straight without the jokes, then he might cut your head off. You never know. But then a modern audience, the Fool is celebrated for his psychological and political insight, and he has massive emotional depth as well. So I think it's very, very interesting. Okay, so now then, with that in mind, you can see that characters do change, don't they? They really do kind of change over time, the interpretations. Now we're going to round off by looking at a nice character arc and how characters change and turning points in this narrative. So first off, what happens at the start of the text? Well, let's have a little look. So we have Lear's division of the kingdom. He decides to split the kingdom up, which is, always a tricky one in this period. So Lear demands flattery from his daughters in exchange for land and power. Say nice things to me and you'll get nice things from me. Okay. So his characterization, it presents Lear as proud, insecure and blinded by his own vanity. He mistakes the false praise for love. Just because someone says something nice to you doesn't mean that they love you. Okay, it could be a lie, and hence his political blindness. King Lear says in Act 1, Scene 1, "Which of you shall we say doth love us most? Who's going to say the nicest things about me?" So he's clearly politically blind, isn't he? Okay, then the turning point, though, for me, is King Lear banishes Cordelia and Kent. That, for me, is a turning point in the characterization of this tragedy. So Lear reacts with fury when Cordelia refuses to exaggerate her love and Kent actually defends her. So the characterization here, it highlights King Lear's impulsiveness and poor judgment, politically that is. He rejects loyalty and honesty in favour of his own ego. And a really good quote to learn for your exams: "Come not between the dragon and his wrath." Okay, so again, he's got a puffed up kind of sense of himself, and the turning point is by banishing Cordelia and Kent, you're getting rid of honest voices who are actually telling it you straight. It's never good in politics. Okay, and then at the end of the text, then there's a lovely kind of part at the end of the text. We have King Lear's reunion with Cordelia. So King Lear begs Cordelia's forgiveness and finally recognises her genuine love. So there is that sense of moral redemption. It portrays Lear as repentant and emotionally awakened, although it is too late by this time. His journey comes full circle from arrogance to humbleness and humility. Lovely quote: "Pray you now, forget and forgive. I am old and foolish." And that's a lovely kind of quote to end on, isn't it, really? So hopefully what you've seen there is the characterization of King Lear is extremely complicated. And it's complicated by Shakespeare's characterization. He writes very complex characters. But also there's a time element, isn't there? Because the Jacobeans saw the characters very different than me and you do. We see them slightly more nuanced now and in a slightly more cynical light. Okay, so don't forget to hit the like, subscribe and tap the bell icon, please. Always feel free to drop comments and stuff, and we'll always reply in the YouTube comments. Share it with all your friends as well, because we're growing the channel now nice and big. Okay then, so it just remains to say hopefully you've had a lot of fun, and yeah, so all the best, take care, and we'll see you soon.